They also removed intercom, which nobody really probably cares because there were very few intercoms left in the property. The biggest change here is going to be those thermostats and the doorbells and TV wall mounts and mounting hardware. If you have a seller that you're working with a listing and they are not wanting to leave that Ring doorbell or that Nest thermostat or even their mounting hardware, you need to exclude it in 1E now. So just,
Mallory,
yes.
would it be possible for you to share your screen with us so we can see where you are on the contract? So, and I want to make sure I know which one you're on. Are you on summary or as is?
I don't have a screen to share. Let me see if I can pull this up. I'm just looking at my contract that I have here. I'm looking at the actual contract itself.
So are you looking at the contract black draft or at the red line draft?
The black draft, or you can look at the red line draft if you want so that it might show you exactly what the changes are. I've just been looking at it so frequently that I'm just using the black draft, but red line is probably best for everybody so that it's directing you where the changes are.
And let me get that up and let me see if I can share that so that it'll be a lot easier for people to follow if we are pointing to where we are in it.
Sorry about that.
So were you under personal property section?
I was on 1D.
Real quick, Mallory, these changes, are they the same for as is and standard, or are we just focusing on the as is contract right now?
All of the changes are identical except for very few in section 12 for the standard contract. There's very minor things. I'm going over the as is contract, but when I get to that section in section 12 that I know is there in the standard, I'll tell you what they are. They're very minor, but the big changes are all the same throughout both contracts.
Okay, so do you have my screen? Is everybody seeing my screen? Okay, I see a nod from Mariah. Okay, so Mallory, if you would just tell me what sections you go to so I can move forward to that, and I'll remute.
Okay, sorry, Craig and everybody else. So that's that section. They also have this new verbiage here right between D and E that says personal property is included in the purchase price, has no contributory value, and shall be left for buyer. I think they put that there. They a little bit finalized it. It used to be there, but I think they put that there in order to kind of have parties know that, you know, it's left for seller's convenience. After speaking to some loan officers, they still do not want a laundry list or exhaustive list of personal property items that are remaining in the property. And the only other changes on the first page, you can see they have a lot of red lines and blue lines where escrow agent is. They removed information and phone number and email, and now they just have name, phone, and email. They just made the lines longer. That's really the only change. I know it looks a little convoluted, but that's the only change. The next big change is in section 4, that closing and closing date. So there's twofold here. They have redefined what collected means in this contract. Now, according to standard S, which you don't need to switch to that, we'll keep here on this section. Closing occurs when all funds are required for this closing are received by the closing agent and the closing documents are delivered. So the first change there is now it's stating that all the funds required for closing are received and collected. So this is stating that no checks can be delivered. I don't think many title companies or law firms were accepting checks at closing anyways. I know we haven't for quite some time, but now it's just making it very clear that these funds have to actually be collected and in the escrow agent's bank accounts in order to be collected. The second prong of that is going to touch upon mail away closings, especially with buyers. So now instead of it saying shall be delivered in regards to those closing documents, now they are delivered. So in order for us to close on the closing date, all those funds have to be there and all documents. The thing that's going to change here is obviously there's a lot of mail away buyers. If they're using financing, more likely than not, they're going to be either closing on, we'll use today's date as an example, the 14th, and funding on the 15th. The way this new contract is written, and a contract addendum would need to be written because we would not be subject to that closing standard now. So if you know right away when working with the buyer, if they're going to be a finance mail away, in order to be contractually compliant, you either one, have to be speaking to your loan officer or have the buyer speak to the loan officer and make sure that they can pre-sign so that the closing date can still be, just say, the 14th, but the buyers are signing on the 13th and then the documents are still delivered on the 14th. That's the closing date. Or if the lender will not allow pre-signing, and there are some lenders that just will not allow it, they have to sign on the closing date. You're going to need to put in the contract additional terms that the closing date is X date and the funding date is a separate date. And both parties need to agree to that now.
Wouldn't it make sense to do that after the contract's executed and the closing agent provide that addendum? Because we wouldn't know the answer to that question to tell a buyer or seller at the time the contract's written.
Loan dependent. It has nothing to do with the closing agent. The lender is who is going to know and tell you whether they can.
Yeah, but the processors are dealing with the underwriters and the banks.
Yeah, but they should know, no matter prior to a contract, what their process is. They should know if they can allow pre-signing or if they cannot. Obviously, it can be amended after the contract is executed, but it's best practices to have everything signed and delivered. Because what if the seller says, I don't want to do that? Then you are opening your buyer to potential defaulting in the contract if the seller doesn't agree to it.
What would be the difficulty of having it signed, showing that it, or saying that it's going to be signed and funded the next day and just leave it that way and get it signed, and that way you're covered, because otherwise it would just close earlier and that wouldn't affect the seller.
That's what I'm suggesting, is to put.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm sorry for the confusion.
All right. And then moving down to section 5.
Howard, your microphone has gotten quiet. I've got my volume all the way up, but I'm just barely hearing you.
I can put my face closer. I haven't changed anything, so I should.
Same as us. Okay.
And then in section 5, it made it very clear. We used to get all the time from out-of-state lenders that, oh, there's an automatic extension for 10 days. This is pointing to this section. Now the contract reads a little bit differently. It states very clearly that this section is only allowed if 8B is checked. So if this is a finance contingency deal, if loan approval has been obtained and the underwriting is complete. So it just makes it more clear. We obviously all understood that that section for an extension up to what used to be 10 days, now it's 7, was only for CFPB delivery requirements. And most typically that's if the CD was not signed by the buyer in time, or if the lender did not provide it to the buyer timely. It's very clear now that it's the very last step of the process. It's that only that CD delivery requirement, loan approval has to be obtained, and lender's underwriting is complete. So that just made it more clear as to what the point of that extension is for. And again, it's never automatic. And now instead of 10 days, it goes to 7. And that's standard throughout these new contracts. They have removed anything that did extend 10 days. The other part is that force majeure. Now everything is 7 days.
So how often were you seeing this incorrectly used, where an underwriter had not finished yet, and so it automatically kicked it out? Was that common?
So it was tried to be used very commonly, most of the time with out-of-state lenders who didn't have their ducks in a row, and they would say, oh, it's fine, we have a 10-day extension. That's not the case. I have seen this come into play a couple of times when the lender sent the CD maybe at 10 p.m. the night before, when the buyers needed to sign and the buyer was sleeping. So instead of signing it 3 days before, they signed it the next morning. That's a very good example and clear cut reasoning of when that extension would apply. It's only for when that 3-day CD rule has not been met. That's that delivery requirement that the CFPB is defined as in the contract. And then moving down to section 6, there are a couple changes here. 6A is a very minor change. It's just directing parties to use the pre-closing occupancy rider by the buyer if for some reason pre-closing occupancy is going to be used. I know practically speaking, most of the time pre-closing occupancy by a buyer is not something that is discussed at contract time. Usually it's if their sale has closed first and this property that they're purchasing isn't going to go right at the same time for a simultaneous closing. So again, they're just directing it to you there, letting parties know that that is a viable rider to be used. Section 6B, there are some changes here, and these are pretty major changes in this contract. So now in regards to any post-closing occupancy, it's more than just subject to a lease. It's now inclusive of any occupancy agreements, which includes seasonal and short-term vacation rentals. There's a new addendum that we'll go over shortly that discusses this as well. But now if there's any Airbnb, any Vrbo, any property management company that is holding any sort of occupancy agreements, those occupancy agreements need to be provided to the buyer. The buyer still has that 5 days to review any of those occupancy agreements and cancel if the buyer determines in their sole discretion that those terms of occupancy are not satisfactory to them. So if you're working with the seller and you're the listing agent, make sure you are collecting any leases or any occupancy agreements right off the bat so that you have those ready to provide to that buyer as soon as possible so you can close that window.
Mallory, real quick question. When did these changes go into effect?
They go into effect November 1st.
Oh, November 1st. Okay. So if we have a current contract, we don't need to worry about making any modifications to the contract, right? Even if it closes after November 1st.
Correct. So this,
Okay.
as of if you're writing offers beyond November 1st, that's when these contracts come into effect. Anything that may close in December, but currently is under contract, we're still understanding and using the past contract. They do state also in section 6B at the very end, because typically tenant estoppel letters and a seller affidavit are used to just double check and ensure that either rents have been paid or security deposit needs to be prorated. It is stating that tenant estoppel letters are not required on seasonal or short-term vacation rentals. And they did that because it would have been very difficult to get those. I mean, if you're going through Airbnb or Vrbo, sometimes it's almost impossible to get them to give you anything. And most of the time they put the onus on the buyer and seller to transfer themselves. So no tenant estoppels for seasonal or short-term vacation rentals, but you do now have to provide those occupancy agreements for seasonal and short-term vacation rentals. Section 7, they added language now on line 95 that says if no box is checked, then the buyer may not assign this contract. They just make it very clear that if for some reason no box is checked, the contract is not assignable. The bulk of the changes in this contract.
Previously, if no box had been checked, it was assignable. Is that correct?
Well, no, I mean, it's not automatically assignable, where you'd have to need a contract addendum neither way. This is just more making it clear that if for some reason it's not checked, it's not assignable. We would have to get an amendment to the contract. So the bulk of the changes of this contract are in the financing section. 8A, you can see that they removed everything except for verbiage that states this is a cash transaction with no financial contingency. So it makes it very clear that if that box is checked, there are no financial contingencies whatsoever, no financial obligations whatsoever. So if that's that, cash, easy enough, they took away all the other language. And then to B, so it's kind of tricky to read this with all the red lines and green lines and blue lines. I'm gonna go through it broadly. So Craig, if you would just want to scroll to the top of page 3 of the contract and leave it, keep going, leave it like at the top of it, and then we'll just go through it there. So the biggest change is that loan approval now includes an appraisal. The appraisal has to be back and it has to be in value, or loan approval will not be provided. Loan commitment conditioned on obtaining approval is not loan approval, and it very clearly states that in the contract. So now, loan approval in the contract is defined as, one, the buyer obtaining a mortgage commitment or loan approval for, if it's fixed, conventional, all of those terms. And then at the very top, line 109, all of that is the new language. And buyer's mortgage broker or lender received an appraisal or alternative valuation of the property satisfactory to the lender. So that can still be an appraisal waiver. So an appraisal waiver is an alternative valuation of the property that's satisfactory to the lender. So it's not taking away the ability for the lender to have that, but it is including appraisals in the loan approval now. That is going to be the biggest hurdle and probably the biggest step to get over right now. Especially, we need to be educating our buyers that they're going to have to be paying for their appraisal way sooner than they used to, or they're just not going to get loan approval and they're not going to meet their deadlines. I know that's probably going to cause some contention because buyers don't want to pay for the appraisal if they're not out of their inspection period. So we need to be making sure that the contract deadlines are lining up appropriately. So if you have a 45-day closing, and you might not want to have in a 15-day inspection period and then a 30-day loan approval, you might want to extend that loan approval period because your buyer is probably not going to want to give the approval to obtain and purchase that appraisal until after their inspection period. Then you're already at the 16th, 17th day of that contract. Even if you order it timely, we're not sure if that's going to get back within the next 12 to 13 days. So that is the biggest change here, is that you're really going to have to be educating your lenders too. Again, not trying to stress the importance too much of working with a local lender, but a lender in New York or California has no idea that the contract changes. They're going to have no idea that the contract changed in Florida. So you might tell them, hey, the appraisal is part of the loan approval now. They might have no idea what that means. So working with a Florida lender, even more importantly, a local lender, they're going to be aware of these contract changes, and they're going to be making sure that your clients are protected.
I see this as a lot of trip ups happening. I mean, it'll be a good thing in the long run because this was an out that so many buyers had that made financing less effective in on an offer. And this strengthens the financing because the seller will have a loan approval will be more of a real loan approval. 9 times out of 10, the condition that is listed is the appraisal. So this pushes that up earlier.
Yes,
That's good.
It is good, but I do agree it is going to cause some issues at the beginning. I think I'm on the Realtor Attorney Joint Committee, and we work very closely with people who are actually on the committee of drafting this RBAR contract. And their intent with a lot of this was so that contracts are not falling apart 4 or 5 days before closing. They want
Right.
contract to go effective, it stays effective. So they've added another thing in this section 2, that now the buyer can provide seller with property evaluated conditions. They can tell the seller what's going on, what the lender is asking them to use and to fix, so that they can start fixing those items prior to a couple days before closing. So moving down to, I'm right now on line 115. This is in regards to the sale of buyer's property rider. So in the old contract, the contract that we're using right now, If the rider was attached, no loan approval. If it wasn't attached, no loan approval. The contract very explicitly stated that if the buyer's property, or if this purchase was contingent on the buyer's home selling, they would not be ever deemed to have loan approval. Now, the contract states that if rider V is attached, and that's that rider, that sale of buyer's property, they can get loan approval. And the reason for them doing that is because they're stating that the buyer is disclosing that their home is contingent to the seller. It's part of the offer. They can get loan approval. If that rider is not attached, they still cannot get loan approval.
So with that rider attached, it becomes a condition of the approval.
Correct.
Real quick, Mallory, can we go back to the appraisal conversation? I feel like there's a lot of pressure on buyers to waive the appraisal contingency altogether, and sellers are expecting that. So how does that work with this change?
So we're going to figure it out. I know it's going to be a kind of see how we are going through it, because I've spoken to lenders that I work with, and I said the same thing. I said, I mean, right now everybody's waiving an appraisal anyways. So yeah, does this really even matter? And she was saying that her underwriter is not going to like that they need to now, with this new contract, have some sort of appraisal done. Obviously, everything in the contract is negotiable. So I'm sure we're still going to see appraisal waivers happening. I think verbiage is going to have to be tweaked a little bit to perhaps state that buyer and seller are agreeing to waive the appraisal and the requirement for loan approval to be met with that appraisal. I think it's going to have to go a little bit further than just appraisal is waived. I think it's going to also say that the parties are agreeing to remove that requirement under loan approval. It's going to be something that we see kind of how it goes, because obviously this contract isn't in use right now. So we're going to see as things go how they progress. But I think that's probably the biggest change, is that we're going to have to include language that says that both parties are agreeing to not condition loan approval on the appraisal.
And also, everybody remember back to past changes, the majority of realtors don't pay attention to the changes. And so if you've got a listing and it's being submitted, there's a 8 out of 10 chance or a 7 out of 10 chance that the realtor submitting the offer on your listing doesn't know or understand these changes for probably a year, until they stub their toe a few times. So it puts the monkey on your back to protect your seller.
And then another thing, because of the appraisal being added into loan approval, lines 118 through 122, now they include that the buyer paying for the appraisal is part of them using good faith and diligent effort. It is also important to note that the buyer's failure to use good faith and diligent effort is considered default. So now if that buyer is refusing to pay for that appraisal when the lender is saying, hey, we need to get this paid in order for you to get loan approval, if the buyer is refusing to pay it, probably it might be considered a default. So you don't want your buyers to be putting themselves in that situation of, I don't want to pay for this, I'm not ready. When if they don't end up getting loan approval and that seller won't extend, I mean, if for some reason it goes to litigation and there's plenty of proof that they were not giving appraisal status that they could pay for it, it might be claimed as default. And obviously we never want buyers to be under default because they could lose their deposit. So just be mindful of that they actually include paying for appraisal and other fees in connection with their financing as part of default now in that section.
So if you're representing a seller and you receive loan approval notice from a buyer, do you need to, you can't really assume that they have an appraisal already done, right? So is that like a follow-up question? And they're not required to actually send you that appraisal either, right?
They are not, no.
Okay.
Their question kind of goes hand in hand with a new change to this contract. It's actually the next line. So I'll answer your question while showing you something new. So line 123, now you can see it says upon written request. So in the old contract, the buyer had an obligation to keep the seller and broker informed about their status of their loan application. Now they only have to do so if the seller provides them written request. So this is a big change. I have told lenders, because a lot of loan officers will just do that as their weekly recap to disclose to all parties of how the process is going. Now the buyer only has to legally fully inform their status of their loan application, of their loan approval, their appraisal, and any other property related conditions if the seller requests it. So I know a lot of you in your office work as listing agents. That's something that you're going to be wanting to provide immediately. I would suggest if you're going under contract, you're providing that executed offer to buyer's agent, put it in email right then and there. My seller is requesting to be fully informed about the status of the buyer's financing. And then it's there right off the bat. There's no questions. And the buyer is going to be obligated to keep you updated and informed about their status. But now they only have to do that if the seller provides written request. So Mariah, that's stating right there that, you know, if you did request that, the buyer absolutely does have to keep you and your client informed about the appraisal, about the loan approval, and any property related conditions. You just have to request that information. And then moving down, same thing. Now, if you want to go to the top of 129 and we can go from there. So something else that is new. If for some reason we're getting to the end of that loan approval period, just say it's 30 days and we're coming up to, that's good, Craig, we're coming up to the 30th day. If the buyer still doesn't have loan approval and they don't want to ask the seller for extension, or the sellers said, hey, I'm not going to give you an extension. Now the buyer has the option to, instead of just moving forward as a deemed loan approval, now they can actually tell the seller that they are satisfied with their ability to obtain loan approval and they proceed towards closing. So that the big change there is because if for some reason they did not provide that language and that written notice that they are comfortable moving towards closing, they default to an 8A, which now just clearly states it's cash. So I know it's going to be a little bit of how confident is my buyer? Does the buyer really want to have that huge onus on them? But if their seller will not extend loan approval, the buyer does now have the option to say, hey, Mr. Seller, I'm confident that I'm going to get loan approval. I'm going to proceed to closing. And then the buyer still gets to use the rest of their financial contingencies. So if for some reason the seller defaults, or if the property related conditions are not met, they can still potentially get their deposit back. Whereas if they did not provide this notice to the seller of, I'm comfortable moving forward, they default to an 8A contract and do not have any of those protections. Any questions on that?
But the seller can still terminate the contract if they say nothing, right?
So if silence is still there, just again, say 30 days, if by the 31st, 32nd, or 33rd day, there has been no written notice that the buyer either has obtained loan approval, has not obtained loan approval, there's just complete silence, yes, the seller is still allowed to cancel and accept that backup offer or just get out of the contract. And then those are the real big changes. The rest, they're just still kind of making it clear that if for some reason the buyer does not obtain loan approval, they terminate the contract prior to. So there's a bunch of strike through from line 137 to 144. All of that is basically just removing everything and making it very clear that if the buyer does not provide notice, the contract is terminated.
So that's not if they don't, I just want to make sure I'm clear. So if you email the seller, I'm sorry, the buyer at the beginning that you do in fact want them to keep you updated on everything throughout the process of a loan, is that the same as them providing you notice of loan approval, or is that separate from that? Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Separate. So
Separate. Okay, so that is still a requirement whether or not you ask for updates.
correct. So even if the seller does not request for that written request to be informed, the buyer still has a right under the contract to inform the seller and the listing agent, I have loan approval. So just because maybe the listing agent forgot to request that, the onus is still on the buyer to at least state that I do have loan approval or I do not. The seller's right to terminate is not waived by anything of not requesting that written request. If that's, I think that answers your question. All right. And then
So,
moving,
excuse me, it's Claudia Barnett. So you're saying that in all of these situations, an email from the agent representing either party is sufficient as notice?
correct, you are authorized, if your seller authorizes you, if your buyer authorizes you, but more likely than not, they do.
And they authorize us through the listing agreement?
Through the listing agreement or being their client. I mean, I've never run into a situation where there's been a contentious between the buyer and their agent or the seller and their agent, where the seller has said, oh, I didn't tell the buyer or I didn't tell the agent to say that. I think it should be pretty clear that you have a relationship.
So we're not going to have a form, for example, that it would have the language that we aren't removing the financing contingency. We are just acknowledging that we don't have our loan approval yet.
There is no form. No, it's the same as before. Written notice can be provided via email.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, I have another question. So if a uneducated buyer's agent tells you that they have a loan approval, but they don't actually have a loan approval because they don't actually have an appraisal, and then you later find out that they didn't have the appraisal, are they still able to, I guess, get out of the contract because they don't have an appraisal? Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say?
Say it again.
So if they notify you that they have loan approval, but really they don't, according to the contract, because they didn't get an appraisal done, and the contract is subject to them having that appraisal,
Yes. So, okay.
have they notified you of loan? I mean, they're saying you have loan approval, but you really,
This is a great question, because I think this will happen within the first week.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree too. So the way the new contract is, loan approval in the contract is having loan approval and then having an appraisal. So if the buyer is stating, I have loan approval, and they're telling you I have loan approval, it's not our onus to educate them. If they're saying we have loan approval, we have to expect that they have appraisals, that they are moving forward, and that's how they're moving forward. If they don't, no, and it doesn't come back, they can't, just because they haven't met the two-pronged test of what now loan approval is, they can't back out because of the appraisal, because this contract makes it very clear that any loan approval conditioned on an appraisal is not loan approval. So I'm sure if we got to the point where, we're 4 days before closing and they say, oh, well, my appraisal came back and it doesn't meet the terms, we can point them to the lines in the contract that say it doesn't matter. This contract now is not conditioned on an appraisal.
So, I think a key point in what Mallory said there is, it is not our responsibility to educate the other side. That said, it is optional for you to ask that, right? You could say, and the appraisal came in, right? Because that's on the contract. If you don't want to end up blowing up the deal or having to go through an escrow demand and everything like that.
Mhm.
But I'm sure we're going to run into that, like Craig said, probably the week of, because we are trying to do the best we can of educating our business partners and people that we work with, but I'm sure everybody is not doing their due diligence like you guys are today and getting the education.
So conditional loan approval and loan approval, as relates to what Mariah was just talking about, how is that going to play out in terms of what we're talking about with a loan approval?
So I think conditions that we're still going to see that are going to be acceptable for loan approval in our new contract is homeowners insurance bound or something of that nature. The only thing this contract is really changing in regards to conditions is that an appraisal is no longer allowed to be a condition. Anything else of, if we get a commitment back that says loan approval is granted or loan commitment is granted, besides the buyer still needs to bind their homeowners insurance, or they need to provide W-9s, something like that. That's still going to be loan commitment. Those are very typical, and that's also buyer dependent too. The contract still does not really well define what is loan commitment and what is not loan commitment. So I have some buyers that I work with that they will just force any sort of loan approval extension until they have no conditions. That's just how they are. And then I have some buyers who are fine with moving forward with loan approval that's conditioned on finding homeowners insurance, getting their W-9, sending over other things that they know they're going to do. And now this new contract kind of gives those buyers the ability to move forward with loan approval if they're comfortable and satisfied with their ability. So in regards to other conditions though, the only change is that an appraisal is not allowed to be a condition anymore. All right.
Which
So-
was the most common condition that blew up a deal at the last minute.
Absolutely. So that's the biggest change in financing. Obviously, it's a moving wheel. We're going to learn new things as we go on. But those are the biggest changes in the financing section. And then at the very end of financing, lines 152 to 159, that's where prior to it had said that if loan approval had been obtained, then there were still 3 ways that the buyer could get refunded their deposit. Those 3 ways being obviously 1, seller defaults, 2, property related conditions, excluding the appraisal, and then 3, that appraisal. So obviously 3 is gone now. The appraisal is never going to be something that the buyer can get out of if loan approval has been deemed. So now the only 2 ways that the buyer can get refunded if they do have loan approval is if the seller defaults or a property related condition. In section 9, not too much of changes here. 9A, cost to be paid by seller. You can see on line 169, they include charges for FERPTA withholding and reporting. I think most people were aware of that. Now it just makes it very clear on the contract that that is the seller's responsibility. They pay for any FERPTA withholding and reporting charges. And then the next highlight is 219, line 219, where survey is. So the survey used to be conditioned and tied to the title evidence deadline, which in the title evidence deadline, it used to default to, if it left blank, 5 days prior to closing for cash, and it was 15 days prior to closing for financing. Now, regardless of what type of contract it is, and regardless of the title evidence deadline, the survey has to be back at least 5 days prior to closing. I'm a big fan of this change. I think it's going to be helpful for when we have these 30-day finance transactions and the title evidence deadline defaulted to 15 days. We were extending that on our end a lot because buyers didn't want to provide us with the authorization to purchase that survey until they were beyond their inspection period or they knew that they were moving forward. Now we have a lot more time. We have up to 5 days prior to the closing date to make sure that survey is back and we have time to review it. So that's a change there. I think that's going to be a good change. I can't see many people complaining about that one. There is a change in 9FB, line 226. Nothing monumental, but in regards to how it used to just say either it's prorated through taxes or seller pays the special assessment in full prior to closing. Some assessments were not readily available and allowed to be paid in full. So the Longboat Key one, that is allowed to be paid in full, so we're allowed to do that. There are some in Hillsborough and Pinellas County that are unable to be paid in full. So now if they are not, the contract just says, for any assessment with the public body does not allow prepayment, option A is deemed selected. And then lines 232, 233, this will also be a really good change. I don't know if Jason is on this, but him and I actually went toe to toe with another attorney in town about special districts this year. Now it's very clear that they're prorated through the tax bill. So before it just only included chapter 190 in the Florida statutes, which is CDDs. Chapter 189 is special districts. So that's that Lakewood Ranch Stewardship District. Very clear now that it is prorated through taxes.
And just to add to that a bit, because some of you don't really work in areas that have that in Sarasota or Bradenton, but the terminology used for CDD versus a stewardship district versus a special assessment district varies all over the state, Fort Lauderdale, et cetera. And so this expands it because attorneys were trying to trip it up. Hey, it's not a CDD. We still see a lot of those, but under different names. So you have to be aware of that when you look at the tax record.
I'd like to give Mallory a little bit of a shout out with that as well, because her finding and digging into the contract on it and being proven right was a big savings in my commission, because I thought I screwed up from another prominent attorney that I'd done a lot of business with for the first part of my career. So she's won my business going forward. That was a huge save.
Thank you. All right, so the next section where it says line 242, it's a statutory change. So in 2019, there was an update to the Florida statutes in regards to how we as closing agents can close open or expired permits. I don't know if anybody read that in 2019, but the basis of that, the big change was that, hold on, let me move my phone. The basis of that change was that now closing agents, if there's an open or expired permit that has been there for more than 6 years, all we have to do is get the county to go out there and inspect it for safety hazards. And if there are no safety hazards, they can close them out. No need to reopen them or go through all of that or bring the property into compliance. They just have to check for safety hazards. So that's the biggest rule there. Now, if we are getting our lien searches back and there's an open or expired permit from, I don't know, what year is it? 26 years ago, then we don't have to go through those opening and all of that. It saves the sellers a lot of money, and it's been really good because lien searches didn't really start until 9 or 10 years ago. So this is bringing the contract just up to date with where we are statutorily and contractually. And then moving down, for the flood zone section, they removed those last lines there. Doesn't really do too much. The FEMA rule is still in apply. It's just removing that the flood insurance program can assess additional fees. It doesn't have any real changes for the contract. I think the next biggest change, this is not in the as-is contract, but for the property maintenance in the standard contract, how I said I would just touch upon it. The only change in that is in the section 12B3. It just states that the seller can have repairs completed at their expense, which they already were doing, and it was still going hand in hand with the repair limits. It's not in this contract, but that's the only change. Everything else is the exact same from this contract to the other one. And then now, Craig, if you can go all the way to page 11 of this, we're in time under standards F. Yeah, keep going. No, not much changes here.
Done?
Nope, a little bit, so go to F. Where time and force measure is. Go up a little bit more.
Up.
Or up, like to page 9. My handout.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said go to page 11. So I was
It's
moving
page
back.
11 on my handout. Sorry.
Okay.
Apologize. So F, there we go. Right, go up a tiny bit more and then we'll be good. So F and G, there were some changes here. They moved time is of the essence to the very beginning of that section, just to politely remind everybody that time is of the essence in this contract. They also make it clear that calendar days in this contract, and same with the standard contract, are based where the property is located, not where the buyer or seller are located. Unfortunately, we've gotten that comment quite a few times. And then the main change in this section is that they are removing 5 PM from this contract, from every contract. There are no more, because the inspection period or loan approval ended on a Saturday or Sunday, it falls to 5 PM. Now it just falls to 11:59. The 5 PM rule is dead. So that's the biggest change. Now you guys have 7 more hours to negotiate inspections and repairs. So you are welcome. So that's what that is for. That's the main change, is that you have more time.
So does that make it so that all timeframes are now 11:59?
Correct. Every single
Okay.
time frame, on one of the riders to the backup contract rider, they take off 5 PM. So 5 PM is gone. It's only 11:59 now.
Unless you specify a time on the offer to be accepted on the first
Yeah,
page.
but that's the same. That was the same as before.
Yeah.
So, and then section G is the force majeure section. There are some changes. Do I think it would have really solved any problems? No, that's the general consensus. I think if this verbiage was there, go to page, it's probably page 10 or maybe 9. It was right under time. It's standard G in the contract,
It's on 9, okay.
9 or 10. I print out different, so.
I don't know, I'm confused now.
No, page 9 or 10, sorry. It's right
Okay.
under time where we just were. So like closer to the end of the contract.
Line 475.
Okay,
Thank you. Yep, almost there. Okay, that's good. So they have added a lot of words, and then they took away some things as well. So now force majeure not only is about buyers' obligations or sellers' obligations, it's about their rights that they have under the contract too. So it applies to those. They also added, as you can see, what defines force majeure. So now they have civil unrest, governmental actions, mandates, government shutdowns, epidemics, pandemics. The reason why I still don't think this would have made much of a difference if we did have this in last March when all of this started happening is that that is the first prong of the test, is to have your event be defined as a force majeure event. And yes, so that first prong of the test would have been met because now pandemic, shutdowns, mandates, all of that is inclusive. However, the most important prong of the force majeure test is that there is unavailability of services and insurance isn't able to be bound or not able to do things. Availability of service, insurance, approvals essential to closing, those were all really still able to happen in the state of Florida. We did have a couple weeks where it was difficult to get to banks or you couldn't get a mobile notary. But even with this new language of including epidemics, pandemics, shutdowns, the second prong still would have been able to be met down here. And I think that was our biggest hurdle last year, is we had so many out-of-state buyers from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, wherever, that they were shut down. But the way the contract is written, and it's still written like that, if the availability of services in Florida is still available, then you still have to close. Force majeure is not met. So they did include that language. It does define now when the force majeure event starts. That's line 482 and 483. So it does state that it's deemed to have begun the first day of the effect of the force majeure event prevents performance, non-performance, or the availability of services, insurance, or required approvals. So they added language there. Again, all the attorneys here at BPE, we spent significant time going over this, and we all were unanimous that this wouldn't have really done much for what happened last March. They do, if you scroll down a little bit, it still does now have 7 days here. And then still the same language of if something goes beyond 30 days, either party can terminate. That wasn't added, still there. Just want to show that there. So that's that. Not too much changes. The last two things that we have here, Craig, is O, line 650.
Could you just go over line 505, reporting obligation? What is that? I mean, is that referring to Bitcoin, for example, or I'm not sure
505.
what line
But
505.
that's in Miami. We're not FinCEN, so it
Oh,
doesn't.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
I didn't,
only in Miami.
Is there anything else like that that's only in Miami? Or
There's
would
one other
this-
section but it applies to FinCEN and they have a Miami-Dade provision, but the only place that does that right now, to my knowledge, is Miami, that reporting obligation. So section O, it's line 650. Or no, sorry, I'm in the standard contract, so go up, it's not 650. I didn't realize we were doing as is contract, it's the same thing basically, but,
What am I looking for?
you're looking for, it says contract not reportable, persons bound.
What?
Go up a tiny bit more, it's like 562.
562, 552.
Perfect, that's great.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So, where it says all notices must be in writing and may only be made by mail, fax, personal delivery, or email. Go down a tiny bit more, Craig. So 565 to like 570, if you go down a tiny bit more, just so everybody can see it.
That's where I'm at, 570. Is
Yep,
that not showing?
I guess my computer had a delay. I see it now. So they removed electronic media, including PDF. From my understanding, they did that to remove that agents are sharing contracts via text messaging. I don't know how many agents were doing that, but that is not an approved method anymore. They're really directing parties to use email, because texting can get deleted. And so now it's stating that all notices are only allowed to be by mail, fax, personal delivery, or email. So they removed that PDF and they removed the electronic media in regards to remove texting.
Okay, Ben, if you're on right now, please ignore the advice I gave you earlier today.
Well, until November 1st. This is till November 1st. So you can keep listening to Craig. So
So when we get subpoenas, which we do get on a regular basis, we are expected to provide all text messaging records. Would that still hold true, or does this negate that?
So it's still going to hold true because you can subpoena for that because they're going to want anything that was in writing, but it's just telling parties that for notices, so notice provisions, they have to be an email. I don't think anybody was, and I hope not, nobody was texting, hey, my buyer has loan approval, but that's what they were trying to avoid here. And then the last line of the contract, they removed all of that verbiage that states seller counters, buyer's offer, and that seller rejects. Now it just very clearly states right there, line 651, that seller counters buyer's offer. So they removed the other language. I don't think anybody ever really used seller rejects. So they removed that. Now it's just seller counters buyer's offer.
So it's not required to check that box and return it though, is it?
It's not.
Okay.
So that's the contract. And then there are a few changes in the riders as well. Do you have those as well, Craig?
Yeah, sure. Hold on, let's see. I've got, the summary of Florida Realtors rider updates.
Yes, please.
All right, hold on. I don't think that showed. Let me go back here and share that.
so on the last page where it says listing and cooperating brokers, is that meant to avoid any kickbacks to your buyer or seller?
I'm not really sure what you mean by that. It's always said listing broker.
Listing and cooperating brokers are the only brokers entitled to compensation in connection with this contract. So for example, I've had situations where the buyer's agent wanted to give the buyer $2,000 and you guys said, no, can't do it.
You can't do that. That's, I mean, it's the only people to be paid from a real estate contract are the listing brokers and the cooperating brokers. Nobody else should be paid from this contract. That's how it's always been. So,
Right, and that's what it says. Okay.
So are you seeing the summary of changes to the rider now on your screen?
yes, I'm seeing
Okay.
that. So these changes, this is more of like a helpful tool for you guys because it shows the changes and then it summarizes them. With the HOA disclosure, they've made it more cohesive with the condo rider. All of these changes are good. They always had approval on HOA. Now they just make it very clear on line 1. You see the red line there. So same thing with the condo rider. Now it's just clear on the HOA rider. And then if you scroll down to section 2B, that's where the bulk of the changes are on the HOA rider. Again, it's the same thing as the condo rider, but the HOA rider previously did not discuss what happened with association assessments that were levied beyond the effective date and are due and payable prior to the closing date. Now it does. So this is the exact same way that the condominium rider works. It just now is inclusive with HOA. So that's a good update to have. Now everything will be cohesive, and same thing if it's a condo or an HOA.
But the contract isn't subject to them being able to review the HOA documents, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Condo only has that 3-day rule. And then the FHA and VA rider, they finally defined what the VA is in the contract. So that's not listed there, but in the definition sections, they had never defined VA. So now they do. And now they have deleted termite inspection, roof inspection, and it's broad. It just states lender required inspections. And they define that as appraisal repairs. So that's what the definition of the contract, that what the VA or FHA can contribute. The biggest changes are, go down a little bit, Craig, for FHA, you can see A. If for some reason that section is left blank, then it automatically defaults to the seller being able to contribute a max of $100 if it's left blank. So if you are working with a seller who does not want to contribute to an FHA or a VA buyer, you need to put 0 there. If you leave it blank, you're putting the seller on the hook for up to $100. With VA, it's $250. So that's section A, same thing. If it's left blank, it's up to $250. And again, remember they generalized it. It's really just for lender inspections and appraisal fees. And that's almost anything. So if you do not want your seller to have to pay anything, or if your seller does not want to have to, just make sure you're putting 0. Mold inspection. So this is only going to be used with the standard contract. No need to use it with the as-is contract, because as-is, you can get whatever inspections you want done. The mold rider that we were using previously was not cohesive with the standard and as-is contract. It was contingent and cohesive with the CRISP contract. So they created this addendum to go hand in hand with the standard contract. This is going to be used when you are working with a buyer that obviously wants to inspect for mold, and it puts a threshold on if that remediation of mold or repair is over X amount. The addendum defaults to 500, then the buyer gets to cancel that contract. If it's left blank, the automatic days that it defaults to is 20 days for a mold inspection. So that's something that if you're working again with the standard contract only, that's going to be the rider that you attach. And then what's the next one that you have? So rider L, right to inspect, the change, if you go down to the last line, it's number 5. They just or it was numbered 5. They removed it. It already said the exact same thing in section 2. So it was redundant. They removed it just because we don't need redundancy. Pre-closing occupancy by the buyer. Pre-closing and post-closing occupancy, the riders are the same. Basically, the changes are the same. You can see that now they have included language that says pre-closing occupancy agreement or similar agreement. I'm a big fan of this because no attorneys drafted leases for post-closing or pre-closing occupancy because we don't want to afford landlord tenant rights. We draft licenses because it's less responsibility on the buyer and the seller. So now this is inclusive. It's more broad that when we're drafting these licenses or these post-closing or pre-closing occupancy agreements, that's very defined and it's clear here. So that's the only changes in the pre-closing and post-closing. They just make it more broad that it does not have to be a lease. So that's the same change there. It just finds post-closing agreement instead of a lease. Sale of buyer's property. So this, it's really clarifying that there's that two-prong test. So it was still already there, but this contingency does not have any force and effect if the buyer's property doesn't close by the date listed in that first line, and if the buyer does not timely provide that notice that they are terminating the contract. So it's still there. It was the same thing. It just makes it more clear that the buyer has to provide written notice to terminate this contract. And then now they have included that new language that the buyer has to provide that accepted offer within 24 hours. And it has to be delivered. It does state that party's identification and purchase price can be removed, or you can use very strong language like obliterated, like the contract did. But you do have to provide that no later than 24 hours. So that needs to be provided immediately. Backup contract. So earlier when I said that 5 p.m. has been removed, again, they removed it here. So the 5 p.m. deadline is now gone. It's consistent with the other contracts and riders that it's 11:59 p.m. And then the second change clarifies that if a deposit has been made, and this is the backup offer is terminated, obviously we give back the deposit to the buyer. I don't think most people give deposits until they're in first position, but if they did, now it makes it clear. And then the last two, these are brand new. So this one, seasonal and vacation rentals after closing. This again is included in section B, but if you are working with a property that does include seasonal and vacation rentals after closing, this needs to be used. And this is very important. I see this more and more frequently, especially on Anna Maria, Longboat. There's seasonal and vacational rentals everywhere. So if there's two different sections that we're going to go through. A is either stating that the buyer and seller agree that the seller may or may not, after the effective date, but prior to closing, enter into new occupancy agreements. So if it's a rental property and the buyer wants to give the seller the ability to continue to enter into new or renewal seasonal vacational rentals, they can give them that option too. If they indicate that the seller may enter into these agreements, then the next box is whether the seller is allowed to do so only with buyer's approval or without. So that's going to be something that, again, always necessary. If there are seasonal and vacation rentals, this rider has to be attached and it needs to be filled out. Section B discusses property management agreements. So property management agreements are not defined in section 6B in the contract. They're defined here. And this is when they discuss that they have to be provided to the buyer. This is very important because this again provides the buyer with 5 days to review these management agreements after they've received them. And if the buyer finds them to be unacceptable for them, the buyer can cancel. So you want to be getting those property management agreements as soon as possible. It does state too that this provision and those management agreements survive closing and they are in force until the duration of those occupancy agreements are terminated. So I have a file right now where it's on Anna Maria. There's a property management company and they have bookings for the next 2 years and they're under contract with this management agreement for 2 years. My buyer does not want to deal with it. He wants to just live in it. And the agents went back and forth negotiating for probably almost 9 days onto what they were going to do. This rider is going to be so beneficial in the future because all of that is going to be done prior to contract execution. And it's going to save a lot of deals because so many times this deal has almost fallen apart because of this. This rider, none of this would have happened during contract. It would have all been occurring prior to even going effective. So I think this rider is going to really set expectations and be very beneficial. And then the last one is about PACE. So property assessed clean energy. This is going to be used as twofold. One, it fulfills the seller's statutory duty to disclose that they do have a PACE lien on their property. And it also puts buyers on notice that if a buyer is purchasing with financing, that their lender is more likely than not going to require the satisfaction or release of that lien. The easiest way to go about this, if you're working with a seller, when you're getting that listing agreement signed, ask them, hey, do you have a PACE lien on your home? If they don't know what that is, they probably don't have a PACE lien on their property. If they don't really know, you can sometimes find it on the property appraiser's website on the tax collector. The county is usually a year backed up. So I've had instances where I know that there's a PACE lien on the property, but it doesn't reflect on the property appraiser's website. That does show up as a lien on title. So we always have to satisfy them or either pay them in full. I've also heard this being used for hot water heaters and solar panels. That's usually the two biggest ticket items that these PACE liens are used for. So this is also going to be good. It was a huge hiccup on a lot of files that the seller had no idea that they were required to pay it off, or buyer didn't realize that they were going to have to either have the option of getting it paid off or assuming. So anytime a property does have one of these liens on it, this rider needs to be attached, and it does twofold. It provides the seller statutory disclosure, which is at the bottom if you go a little bit more, Craig, and then it lets the buyers know too. And then that's it. Those are all of the changes. So the biggest things to take away, really no 5 p.m. rule, the personal property section, just be mindful of what is there now and what your sellers might not be wanting to convey. And then obviously the appraisal being added to loan approval. Those are probably the biggest changes. I'm happy to answer any questions. Once you've digested all of this information, you can email me or give me a call and we can talk through more things together. But that's all I have for today.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Anybody have any questions they want to ask now? Or are you all learned
Is there
out?
is there any reason why we would need to look at the standard contract, or the changes pretty much the same?
They are exactly the same, except for that one that I pointed out to you where it says at seller's expense. You can take a look at it. It's in section 12B3, but it's 7 words. So it's nothing
Okay.
mental. What you've learned here today will set you up for success on either contract.
And I think before everybody peels off, most of you already know this, but it's worth restating, because the longer I'm a broker, the longer I realize how different contracts are in every single state. And a lot of the pushback and confusion that we get is because either the buyer who has purchased or sold in another state, or their attorney or their lender really is thinking about things from their home state's perspective. So this is going to be just all, in addition to our contract being different, all the changes will be even more so. So keep that in mind.
And this goes into effect November 1?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
November 1st.
Okay.
Well, thanks,
Well,
everyone.
sounds good. Thank you very much.
Bye. I'll see some of you guys on Tuesday.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, Tuesday, sales meeting, Tuesday.